Right, we're going to start talking about energy and how the body uses it. So, first off, remember we talked about exergonic and endergonic pathways, right? So we're going to kind of put that into catabolic and anabolic, right? So if we look at here, here's an anabolic. Let's deal with the battery. So anabolic. So like a bodybuilder takes anabolic steroids. So anabolic means building. So if I'm making things, it's an anabolic process. And then catabolic then would be breaking down. So catabolic would be breaking down, right? So if you look at the anabolic here, right? So I've got substrates, right? And then I'm going to put energy into them. So the anabolic will store energy in the bonds. So in an anabolic, I'll store energy in the bonds. In a catabolic, so there's my catabolic, right? I'll break apart to release the energy from bonds. So energy. So energy is going to be released from bonds. These two right here, so anabolic and catabolic reactions are called coupled. It means I can't have a catabolic in your body without an anabolic, right? Because if I release energy, I can't just leave that energy in the body or your temperature would rise too much. So I've got to store that energy somewhere. So molecules are broken down, right? So that'd be an exergonic process. Right, to build up molecules would be an endergonic, so it releases energy to store energy. Right, so we can talk about energy strategies, right? So these are energy strategies. Auto means self, troph means eating, right? So autotrophs are self-eaters. So autotrophs produce their energy. Right, so you're most familiar with photoautotrophs. Photo means light. Right? So they use light to produce energy. So a photoautotroph produces through photosynthesis. That's what we're most familiar with. We have chemoautotrophs, right? So there's some bacteria that live near the vents in the ocean, the thermal vents from the volcanic action in the mid-Atlantic. Right, and those bacteria use energy from those chemical processes to store. We also have the methanogens that live in the guts of cows, right? So a photoautotroph uses light as its energy source. A chemoautotroph uses some sort of thermal or chemical energy, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. We're not going to go much into photosynthesis because we just don't have time this semester. A heterotroph is most things on Earth are heterotrophs. So these consume organic compounds created by autotrophs to convert the energy into ATP. Okay? So they convert energy into ATP. Right? So we can have different strategies. So you are a heterotroph because you consume other things. Right? You can be an herbivore. And you can consume only plants. You can be a carnivore and consume only other animals. Or you can be an omnivore and you can take your pick. So you are an omnivore, right? You consume plants and animals, right? I'm mostly vegan, but I have fish about once a week, right? So I'm a pesca-vegan. So I'm an omnivore. I don't only eat plants, I eat animals. And no matter what your strategy is, as an organism, you're designed to be an omnivore, right? So remember, I get energy from catabolism, the breaking down, to build ATP, and then I have, in an anabolic reaction, then I have energy for work, right? Production of ATP. So most of what we're going to do today, and then again next week, is focus on the production of ATP. Right? ATP is the, as we've already talked about, that's the molecule that stores energy in the body. Right? And then the energy is found in the bonds between the P. So for the P here, a lot of times these are phosphate groups, right? But we use the P and the I means inorganic. It came from an inorganic, not an organic source. Organic means anything living, right? So ATP has 3 of these, and the energy is stored in the bonds between the phosphates, right? So if I have ADP, so that's adenosine. That's what the A stands for. This is diphosphate. If you visualize it like a battery, I still have a bond. I can use, right? So I still have a little energy in that battery. But if I add another phosphate to it, I get some triphosphate, right? And then that way my battery is full, right? So I can only hold 3 phosphates. Adenosine is actually a nucleic acid, right? So I have a nucleic acid, right? So ADP makes ATP. So I will use this ATP, I'll take a phosphate off it, I'll get to use that energy. It'll become ADP, and I'll feed it back into the system, right? If I'm really short on energy, I can take another one out of here and I can make AMP, which is adenosine monophosphate, which we use as kind of a messenger for enzyme reactions, right? So we use cyclic AMP. But we'll talk about that. So ATP equals energy. That's what we said. It's the primary molecule, I said, using the catabolic pathway to produce energy and power. Right? So ATP, if I take one of those phosphates, that's the PI I told you about, right? I get to use the energy from the bond. Right? And we'll talk about nucleic acids. So catabolics and glycolysis. So remember, the catabolic is a breaking down, that's removing. So making ATP is an anabolic process, using the energy is a catabolic process. So glycolysis is the first step. Oh, I'm losing some letters here. So that's my first step. Right. So in all organisms, if you're a bacteria, glycolysis. If you're the person, glycolysis. If you're a plant, you want to use energy, you want to make ATP, it's glycolysis. So glycolysis starts all these processes. Glycolysis is, what do they say, one of these evidences for evolution. Right, so make sure you start to store those in your brain, your evidences, because you'll use them. But glycolysis is where it starts. Remember, glyco means glucose or sugar, and lysis means to break down. So the catabolic process is I'm going to break down sugar, and the first step is glycolysis. Before we talk about that, let's talk about chemical energy. So chemical energy is stored in bonds. I told you that. So it's stored in bonds in food, right? So we had the macromolecules, right? So the macromolecules were carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Those are my 3 macromolecules. Right? So chemical energy, a calorie is a unit of energy, so it's a joule. So in chemistry we use joules. In food science we use calories. So a calorie is equal to 4.184 joules. In our diet, in our labeling, we use a capital calorie, which is a kilocalorie, or 1,000 calories. So in our standard 2,000 calorie diet, really that's 2,000,000, right? Because it's times 1,000, right? So it's 2 million calories. So you're eating 2 million lowercase calories or 2,000 uppercase calories per day, and your dietary labeling has to do with that. We say that not all calories are created equal. 1 gram of carbohydrates is 4 uppercase calories or 4,000 lowercase. A protein is 4, and a fat is 9. And the reason why fat is 9, it's those carbon-to-carbon bonds, right, between those in food. That's where the energy is stored. And remember, fats, right? So if I'm talking about a fat, I got the glycerol, right? I've got my hydrogens. And I've got my long tails. Remember, these long tails are many carbons. And between those carbons, this is why it's 9, because you have all those bonds between those carbons. Okay? But we remember, our primary source of energy is carbohydrate. So glucose I'll use first. And I will never use protein, and I will never use fat unless I run out of glucose. Right, so if I run out of glucose and glycogen, then I can start using other stuff. Right? So this becomes important. So all these people who are having problems, right? I'd like to be a little thinner, I'd like to be a little this, a little that, a little healthier, right? It's all about calories, right? Because you can't transform your body unless you have a requirement greater than your intake, right? Unfortunately, that requirement is created through exercise. It's kind of hard to do that in a pandemic. All right, so we'll talk about cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is the primary catabolic, there's that word again, pathway used to produce energy. So it's the breaking down of glucose, right? That's our primary fuel, right? So C6H12O6, that's glucose, right? And there's oxygen. So this cellular respiration is called aerobic respiration because it requires O2. So to make the most ATP, I have to have plenty of oxygen, right? And I produce CO2, water, and energy, right? So that's what I'm going to produce from it. The stages, we'll talk about glycolysis today. So glycolysis starts with glucose, right? Or I could use glycogen. I could break down my glycogen because remember, glycogen is a bunch of glucose stuck together, right? Or if I run out of glycogen, right, I can go with fats, and I can take fats and modify the glycerol and feed it in to the pathway there. So I can use fats, but only if I run out of glycogen and glucose, right? So I have to use these first before I can use my fats, okay? Right. And then fats, it's you get a chemical message for fat and muscle at the same time. But we're going to talk about glycose. Then we have the citric acid cycles that's sometimes called the Krebs cycle. We'll talk about next week. And then we finally make our ATP down here. We make most of our ATP in that final step, and that requires the oxygen. Okay? So today we're going to focus on glycolysis. So glycolysis is sugar. Remember, that's what glyco means, lysis, to break down. So glycolysis is really just a breakdown of sugar, right? So if I have your cell, right, I have a cell, and then I have a glucose molecule. Right? And by facilitated transport, I'm going to move that glucose molecule in. The first thing that's going to happen is I'm going to make add a phosphate to the end of it, right? So I'm going to add a phosphate to the end of it. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because once I add that phosphate, it can't go back the other way. It doesn't fit the channel anymore, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is modify it a little bit so I trap it inside. And then that is here. So a couple things. So glycogen, remember, is a catabolic process. Right? And it occurs in the cytosol, right? So it's in the gooey stuff. So if I have my nucleus over here, right, and I have my ER, like my mitochondria, my lysosomes, some ribosomes, and some Golgi. All of these organelles here, my glycolysis is still happening in the cytoplasm. All right. Okay, so I got my glucose right here. Right, my glucose has 6 carbons. You can see my 6 carbons right here. Right. So let me expand this. Let me make this bigger for you so we can talk about this. All right. So it requires two ATP. So I have to put energy into it, right? So this is what's often called I keep losing my pen. This is my energy investment. So it requires 2 ATP. So I'll put 2 ATP in and I'll get 2 ATP out. Right? So then I get fructose diphosphate. You don't have to remember those names, but these things, right? So now I have, so this is a 6 carbon sugar, and now I have 2 3 carbon sugars. So I've split that, right? So things enter in, right? So I got glucose, right? Remember? I put in 2 ATP and 2 NAD positive. So these NAD positives, these are electron carriers. Remember, electrons are what's going to be used to store energy in ATP. So they're going to hold, so when we take these apart, right, this glucose apart, I have electrons I can use. And I also got electrons from this ATP here. Right, so I have electrons I can use, right? I'm going to use those electrons, right? So I get my NAD here. I got another NAD over here, right? And I'm going to make NADH. So NAD positive plus 2 electrons becomes NADH, right? So I'll add a hydrogen on there, right? And 2 electrons, and those 2 electrons are stored right there, right? Those electrons from it. So I store those 2 electrons, and this is what's called reduced, or with a greater negative charge. So we say that NAD positive is reduced to become NADH. So that's important because that language is used often in tests and quizzes and stuff like that. So I put in my 2 NAD positive, it becomes NADH. I put in 2 ADPs here, and I make 2 ATPs. Right? So I make 2 ATPs here and 2 ATPs over here. So that's my total of 4 ATPs. right? Or you could say that there's two net ATPs. Remember, because I had to invest two. I had to invest two, and I make 4, so I have 2 net. So I get 2 left over. It's like if you're paid $10 and something costs $5, your net is 5, right? That's what you have left. All right, so if we come back up here, here's the cytosol, right? We'll come back to what we talked about here. Oh, I need my pen for one more second. All right, so if you look up at the top there, I get my new batteries today. So it requires 2 ATP, right, to produce 4. It produces, or 2 NAD positive are reduced to make 2 NADH, right? And then pyruvate is my final molecule. And that's going to be transported to the mitochondria, right? So my glycolysis goes into cytosol, but then it's going to go to the mitochondria, right? Oops. Holy moly. All right. This molecule you have to know. Pyruvate is, so I get 2. And make sure you keep track of it. These are 3 carbon sugars, right? Pyruvate, and this pyruvate is going to be sent to the mitochondria. Okay, all right. A little long today, but that's about where we're stopping.